So welcome to the Cardiff BookTalk event on Octavia Butler's Kindred. We have three expert speakers tonight, Josie Gill, Brittany Henry and David Shackleton. They will receive proper introductions shortly, and I'm sure you're all very excited to hear about their research on Butler today. So in the meantime, as I've said, please use the chat box to use the button to say all attendees and panelists, and you can tell us where you're listening from. You will be able to ask questions at the end of the presentations today. You can do that using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So we have 78 people here. That's brilliant. So great to welcome you all to our event tonight. I'll say a bit more about forthcoming events at the end of this event, but right now we want to get immediately to the novel that's under the spotlight this week and that we're also excited to discuss. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Alex Beeston, who will be hosting tonight and chairing our discussion. Alex is a senior lecturer in English at Cardiff University, and her research is interdisciplinary in scope and feminist in approach, focusing on modern and contemporary literature, photography, and film, especially in the United States. Alex teaches at Cardiff on modules such as Object Women in Literature and Film and Representing Race in Contemporary America. But she is currently on research leave and has been awarded a very exciting fellowship from the University of Sydney and a Franklin Research Grant from the American Philosophical Society. Alex will now introduce the book and the speakers, and I'll pass it over to her now. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks so much, Anna. I'm just going to grab my slides. Just give me 2 seconds. Okay, thanks so much for that introduction, Anna. It's really wonderful to be here. Thanks to you and to the whole Cardiff BookTalk team. This takes a lot of work to put on this event, and I'm so pleased to be here and grateful for all of your work. It's my great pleasure to be hosting tonight's discussion of Octavia Butler's Kindred, and we have three wonderful guest speakers here to share from their expertise. Before I introduce those speakers, I want to give a little bit of context to set up our discussion of this very important and influential novel. But to do that, and perhaps to demonstrate the influence of this book, I want to turn briefly to a recent film that I think exists in quite direct conversation with Kindred, and this will be elaborated on actually by one of our speakers in a little bit of time. The film is the horror comedy Get Out, which I'm sure many of the participants here this evening have seen, and if you haven't, you're in for a treat. You should totally watch it. It's brilliant. So it was directed by Jordan Peele in 2017. And what I'd like to do to kick off our time this evening is to show you a short clip from around the midpoint of the film. And this clip draws out, I think, some of the connections that we might start to make between Peele's purposes in Get Out and Octavia Butler's purposes in Kindred. So some basic plot points so we all can be oriented. Chris, who is played by Daniel Kaluuya, is visiting the home of his girlfriend's parents for the weekend. The girlfriend is called Rose, and she's played by Alison Williams. But something is not right about this whole setup. Alison's parents host a garden party full of rich, mostly white people who all seem inordinately interested in Chris. And then the only other Black person in the party, a guy called Logan, has what seems to be some kind of like psychotic break that Chris doesn't know how to make sense of, but he kind of grabs Chris and he freaks out and he yells at him, "Get out," hence the title of the film. The action then splits to two locations. So out by the lake, Chris and Rose are discussing Chris's plan to return to the city because he's just really freaked out by this whole situation. And meanwhile, back at the party, the guests assemble for the world's most sinister game of bingo, presided over by Alison's father. So let's watch the clip now. And as we do so, I'd like you to think about what are the differences between the two scenes that we cut between here and what effect it has to put them together in the way that Peele has.
My cousin's epileptic. That wasn't a seizure, right?
My dad's a neurosurgeon, and that's what he said it was. I'm inclined to trust.
That wasn't a seizure.
What was it then?
How long have you known that guy?
I met him today. Why?
I mean, this is going to sound weird, but When he came at me, it felt like I knew him.
Like you've met Logan before?
No, I don't know Logan. I knew the guy that come at me. I think your mom got in my head, right? I think she got in my head.
Yeah, and it worked, I thought.
It did not. It didn't work. She got in my head, and now I'm thinking all this fucked up shit that I don't want to think about.
Like what?
I just need to go.
You want to go?
Mm-hmm.
Without me?
Whatever you want.
I really love this film. I'd love to just keep watching it with you all. Basically, as we watch this scene, we realize that this bingo game is actually a live auction for Chris, a kind of modern day version of a slave auction, such as those that were a regular part of life for hundreds of years in the United States. So you'll have to go away and watch the rest of the film to see how everything pans out. But what I want to point out about this particular scene for our purposes this evening is that it makes a very particular point about contemporary American society, and particularly white liberal society, and its relationship to the past. Notice how we cut between Rose and Chris's totally normal conversation on the lake and this unthinkable event of a person being sold off back at the family estate. The cross-cutting of these two scenes, which kind of moves back and forth between them, makes them seem connected to one another. The scholar Alison Landsberg puts it really well, I think. She writes, the cross-cutting in this scene emphasizes the coexistence of these two events. This auction is happening within and is perhaps a central facet of liberal white society. The film performs a radical form of history writing, bringing the present into contact with an unexpected past, precisely to interrupt the present. And she continues, the slave auction in the present forces us to reread the present in a radically different way. It calls attention to the emergency that is the present. Now, Jordan Peele's project, I think, is somewhat similar to that of Octavia Butler in Kindred, which was written in the late 1970s. Butler also uses a mixture of fantasy and reality to make the experience of slavery real to us, kind of to bring it home to us, and using fantasy in a similar way, I guess, to the way Peele uses horror, bringing it home to our bodies, to our experience. And she also works to show us how the past continues to impact on and be felt in the present. She does this also through a quite literal form of cross-cutting, in the sense that her central character, Dana, is pulled back and forth between her contemporary moment and the antebellum period. So that's the period of slavery. Butler's novel emerges in a specific cultural context, And it's partly a response to strains of thought within the civil rights movement at the time. So this will be a very simplified history, but basically from the late 1960s, there was a kind of significant shift in the movement's ideologies and its strategies. So we moved from sort of non-violent resistance that's associated with Martin Luther King Jr. to Malcolm X's militant sort of activism and use of force. And members of the Black Power movement that was associated with Malcolm X believed in militant activity against white supremacy. And what this did was it made them highly skeptical of what they viewed as historical forms of passivity or accommodation to white power. And Butler spoke to these questions when she described the novel's origins in an interview she gave in 1996. She said, when I got into college, the Black Power movement was really underway with the young people. And I heard some remarks from a young man who was the same age as I was, but who had apparently never made the connection with what his parents did to keep him alive. He said, I'd like to kill all these old Black people who've been holding us back for so long, but I can't because I'd have to start with my own parents. That was actually the germ of the idea for Kindred. I've carried that comment with me for 30 years. He felt so strongly ashamed of what the old generation had to do without really putting it into the context of being necessary, not only for their lives, but for his as well. So essentially, Butler sees this young man as misunderstanding his ancestors' behaviour as submissive, as signalling a kind of willingness to comply with white supremacy. And she was inspired, therefore, to write Kindred in order to work against this tendency to minimise the horrors of America's past and to minimise how those horrors impacted on Black people and the possibilities of resistance that were available to them. Okay, so keeping all of that in mind, we're going to now get into our discussion in earnest by hearing three wonderful speakers present original work, research on this book, Kindred. I'm going to introduce them now, and then each of them will give a short talk, one after the other. After that, as Anna said, there'll be time for Q&A. So please have a think about any questions that you might like to ask, and you can start putting them in the Q&A box as soon as you like. So, without further ado, our first speaker this evening, we're very lucky to have Dr. Josie Gill, who is a senior lecturer in Black British writing at the University of Bristol and the author of a wonderful book called Biofictions, Race, Genetics and the Contemporary Novel. She's going to be speaking from her expertise tonight, discussing Kindred's depiction of racist environments and its engagement with epigenetics. And epigenetics is the study of how our environment or our behaviour can cause changes that essentially affect the way our genes work. Our second speaker, coming to us all the way from the United States. Thank you so much for joining us, Brittany. Brittany Henry is a PhD student in English literature at the University of Delaware. Her talk will give us such a richer kind of comparative analysis of Kindred and Get Out, and it will draw on her research into Black cultural studies, popular studies, and 20th and 21st century American literature and culture. And finally, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce one of my dear colleagues at Cardiff, Dr. David Shackleton, who will give our final talk of the evening, explaining Kindred's treatment of time and of history as it connects to the genre of Afrofuturism, which he'll describe shortly. David is a lecturer in English literature at Cardiff Uni, and he's currently working on a book examining time, history, and the modernist novel, as well as its connections to our engagement with the climate crisis. So thanks so much. Let's now turn to Josie for our first talk.
Thank you very much, Alex. I'll just share my screen. Great, so yeah, thank you very much, Alex, for that introduction, and also thank you to Anna for organising and the rest of the team for organising this evening's event. As you can see, I'm going to be talking about the novel in relation to some of the issues that are emerging from the relatively new science of epigenetics. And I'm going to begin this talk by taking you through what some of those issues are and what epigenetics is. So, there's been widespread media coverage in recent years of how the science of epigenetics is changing the way that we think about history and ancestry. In particular, there's been significant coverage of how epigenetics is making links between the lives of enslaved people in the 18th and 19th centuries and the experiences of Black people living today. And as you can see from the images here, the headline news is that trauma can be inherited biologically. So where did these headlines come from and what are they all about? Well, one scientific source is an article which appeared in the American Journal of Human Biology in 2009, titled Low Birth Weight of Contemporary African Americans, an Intergenerational Effect of Slavery. The article looks at why African American babies have tended to have lower birth weights in comparison to the birth weight of other babies in America. And the article attributes this difference not only to contemporary economic inequalities, but to the conditions experienced by Black Americans during slavery, the effects of which, the article claims, have been passed on through intergenerational signals or epigenetic processes. So the author argues that while differences in economic status do account for some of these racial differences in birth weights, when you compare the birth weight of women on low incomes who are African American and who are white, there is still a difference. And the author suggests that this difference can be explained by the influence of intergenerational life conditions, which for African Americans comprises the inadequate diet and strenuous workload of enslaved populations, who experienced an imbalance between energy intake and energy expenditure and had high energetic costs of fighting infectious diseases. So in other words, the low birth weight of African American children today is in part the result of the poor nutrition and the intense labor experienced from a young age by their enslaved ancestors. The experiences of ancestors become embodied in health disparities in the present, and the genes carry a memory of these experiences, to use a metaphor which has been emerging from this science. So what is the science? The science upon which this study relies is epigenetics, which in its very broadest sense is concerned with the interaction of genes with their environment. Epigenetics is a study of heritable changes caused by the activation and deactivation of genes without any change in the underlying DNA sequence of the organism. So the discovery that's really kind of forced scientists to reconsider their long-held assumptions is that these epigenetic marks can be switched on or off according to the environmental conditions in which the body finds itself. And in some cases, these changes can be inherited by offspring and passed from generation to generation. The study of epigenetic mechanisms reveals that the human body's genetic structures can change and change back, that the body is in a dynamic relationship to its environment, and essentially that cultural environments can become embodied. So what's all this got to do with Octavia Butler's Kindred? Well, I want to suggest that Butler's novel might offer us a way of thinking about and understanding the emerging science of epigenetics. While the novel was published years before any of this science came about, it imagines processes of bodily change and transformation which evoke mechanisms in the mechanisms which epigenetic science is now beginning to uncover. Butler uses a fantastical mode to represent the ways in which experiences of racism become biologically embodied and to represent how trauma is inherited. So Kindred, as we know, is the tale of Dana, a 26-year-old African-American woman living in Los Angeles, who on the 9th of June, 1976, is called back in time by her ancestor, Rufus Whalin. Rufus's family owns a plantation in Maryland, and among the enslaved people who work on the plantation is another of Dana's ancestors, Alice. Dana is called back in time to save her white ancestor, Rufus, from harm and from illness at various points across the course of his life. Early on in the novel, Dana realizes that her own survival is dependent on her ability to save Rufus, She must endeavour to keep him alive until he has raped Alice, whose subsequent child, Hagar, Dana knows to be her several times great-grandmother. As Dana ambivalently tends to Rufus, becoming part of the plantation's black population, she is subject to the horrific violence and trauma of being enslaved. While Rufus heals from each accident or illness, Dana is by turns beaten and whipped, forcing her to experience life as an enslaved person firsthand. Only when she truly fears that she might be killed does Dana return to the 1970s and to her new husband, Kevin, who's white. So while Dana's visits to Rufus in the past are often years apart and she can be stuck in Maryland for months at a time, time works differently in the present, where only minutes, hours, or days have passed, giving Dana very little time to recover from her wounds and to prepare for Rufus's next call. And she's only freed from moving back and forth in time when, knowing that Hagar has been born, she finally kills Rufus as he tries to rape her. However, she returns to the 1970s permanently mutilated through the loss of an arm, a loss which she is unable to explain to anyone other than Kevin and which she must learn to live with permanently. So the environment of the Wayland plantation to which Dana is transported is the kind of past environment identified in epigenetic studies of the intergenerational effects of slavery. The novel depicts how this environment shapes the bodies of those who live within it, but also the body of their ancestor, as Dana's trips back to the past come to be defined by the pain and injuries which she sustains as a result. Dana's first meeting with Rufus occurs when she rescues him from drowning, but it is overwhelmingly defined by her experience of being beaten by his mother, Margaret, as Dana is trying to resuscitate him before she returns at the threat of being shot, wet and muddy, to the present, with an ache in my back and shoulders where Rufus's mother had pounded with her fists. Such injuries only increase as Dana first witnesses the flogging of an enslaved person before experiencing something similar herself shortly afterwards. The man tackled me and brought me down hard. He began hitting me, punching me with his fists. When later sent to work in the field, she relates how, I didn't think my shoulders could have hurt much worse if they'd been broken. Sweat ran down into my eyes and my hands were beginning to blister. Tom Whalen attacks Dana after he discovers that she's been teaching Nigel, an enslaved boy, how to read. And she says, I never saw where the whip came from, never even saw the first blow coming, but it came like a hot iron across my back, burning into me through my light shirt, searing my skin. I screamed, convulsed. Whalen struck again and again until I couldn't have gotten up at gunpoint. So, and there are many more examples. There's a real emphasis in the novel on the harsh and violent conditions of the plantation that Dana is forced to withstand. And on each occasion, she returns to the present, exhausted and in pain, her injuries getting worse and worse until eventually she loses her arm. Dana's mutilation highlights the pain and the trauma that comprise the history of slavery in America. As Butler suggests, that African Americans have to learn how to live with this pain. Slavery isn't just something that happened in the past. For Dana, it becomes a living history, a history she not only knows intellectually, but actually feels in her body and that she will carry forward into the future. Now, I think it's possible to view Dana's biological inheritance, which is represented by these kind of scars and mutilation. Obviously, it's possible to view that quite negatively as something that determines and limits her, something that she's powerless to escape. And this has been a concern that's been raised about epigenetics. The sociologist Maurizio Maloney writes that the inheritance of acquired characters is a double-edged sword. The scars of past exposures and traumas can give rise to ideas of specific groups being too damaged to be rescued. So there's potentially a danger that an epigenetic view of inheritance might give rise to a new form of biological determinism, where certain populations, or indeed racial groups, are considered irrevocably marked by their ancestry and thus unable to kind of escape the past. And, you know, I think this is a real concern. But I also think that this is where Kindred shows us why we might not need to be so worried about this possibility, or at least that there are alternatives to the potential for determinism and discrimination as epigenetic discoveries develop. And I think that the novel suggests that, in fact, a kind of freedom is achieved for Dana through her acquired intergenerational body knowledge, an inheritance which, while physiologically limiting, is also on some level empowering and healing when it is fully known and understood. because it is Dana's experiences in the past that awaken her to the realities of her present, the subtle forms of racism and sexism that surround her and determine her life in the 1970s. The past in the novel is not only that of the early 19th century, but also the much more recent past of Dana's life. As the narrative moves back and forth in time, it often returns not to the present, but to Dana's descriptions of her life with Kevin in the months before she began to time travel. And it is in these descriptions of the more recent past that Butler draws parallels between Dana's life in the present and the experience she has on the whaling plantation. So, for example, if we think about her relationship with Kevin, at first glance, it seems relatively unextraordinary. They meet while they're both working out of a casual labour agency, drawn together by the fact that they're both writers and using the agency to supplement their income. While Dana narrates her burgeoning love for Kevin, it is punctuated by small, subtle, uncomfortable insights into his character. When they first meet, Kevin assumes that Dana flunked out of high school. Then when they start thinking of living together, Dana recalls how he encourages her to quit her job. Kevin gets annoyed and then angry when Dana refuses to type his manuscripts. He said if I couldn't do him a little favour when he asked, I could leave. Kevin's microaggressions, both racial and patriarchal, demonstrate that beneath his relaxed liberal exterior, he holds little regard for Dana's needs, and there are many more examples of this that I don't have time to show. Dana has been conditioned to put up with his attitude, but as she begins to travel back and forth in time, she begins to relate to his behaviour differently. She begins to see small parallels between her petulant, needy and narcissistic ancestors, Rufus and his father Tom, and with Kevin, who, while maintaining an abhorrence for slavery and defending Dana, cannot quite comprehend her experiences. So when fighting off a patroller who's trying to rape her, Dana returns to the present to find Kevin on top of her, who, before allowing her to rest and recover, wants to know, did he rape you? A question he asks her again at the end of the novel about Rufus. What's he done to you? While Dana explains that she hasn't been raped, Kevin doesn't quite believe her, and his attitude betrays the sense of ownership he feels he has over her body. He looked at me uncertainly. Look, if anything did happen, I could understand it. I know how it was back then. To which Dana replies, you mean you could forgive me for having been raped? Well, Dana tries to be as clear as possible, and she says, I'm not property, Kevin. He only half understood. So when Dana narrates at the start of the novel that the trouble began long before the 9th of June 1976, when I became aware of it, she's signalling her narrative as being written with a newly acquired understanding of her recent past, an understanding developed because of her visits to the 19th century and her subsequent injuries. Dana's altered relationship to time and space helps her to see the nature of racism differently, to see that it is not her time travel, but white supremacy and patriarchy which distort and warp the real. As she moves back and forth in time, what initially feels to Dana like a temporal disjunction becomes familiar and homely, something revealed in the famous first line of the novel, I lost an arm on my last trip home. In this, Dana signals that the plantation is for her as much as home as her new house with Kevin. And while this acclimatization disturbs Dana, she's also aware that, quote, some part of me had apparently given up on time-distorted reality and smoothed things out. Her inability to remain an observer and to maintain the distance between past and present, however uncomfortable, is how she learns to feel at home with the truth of her family history. Dana never attempts to alter history, and there's no attempt to change her body from being marked and scarred. Instead, Butler presents Dana's newfound body knowledge as a form of empowerment rather than determinism, a means of understanding what it means to be an African-American woman in late 20th century America, which is to live with racialization and racism across space and time. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Josie. We'll turn now to Brittany.
Need to unmute myself. Hello, thank you so much for having me. And Alex, thank you so much for introducing me. I will be taking us through Octavia Butler's Kindred in conversation with Jordan Peele's Get Out and thinking through Peele's concept of sunken place and how we've seen this before in Butler's work. Octavia Butler has been called the mother of science fiction and Afrofuturism. Kindred is just one of the many novels written by the author, and I have listed her other works, with Fledgling being the last published before her death in 2006. Jordan Peele started his career in comedy, shocking viewers with a drastic change in genre when his film Get Out debuted in 2017. He wrote and directed the film. While his film is marked as horror in the American market, I would argue this film is a Black science fiction narrative. Do I define popular culture, or does popular culture define me? I thought this meme illustrated the way I want to engage with popular culture. I think that's a really good question for us to be asking. It's important to note that popular culture is not apolitical. Get Out is as political as it gets. We view popular culture as an escape, but it really isn't. Everything we come in contact with is going to somehow impact us. Popular culture reflects and contours our everyday lives. Popular culture can sometimes define our existence, but it can also distort our existence. Like Jennifer Mueller et al. Says, it can be for the best, but oftentimes it's for the worse. And what do we do when it is the worst? Through science fiction, we can explore that as this genre within the space of Black popular culture has illustrated forgotten or distorted historical events within American culture. Cudwo Eshin states, Black existence and science fiction are one and the same. Mark Derry furthers this notion, claiming, in a very real sense, Black people are the descendants of alien abductees. They inhabit a sci-fi nightmare. Official histories undo what has been done, and technology is often brought to bear on Black bodies. Branding, forced sterilization, the Tuskegee experiment, and tasers come readily to mind. We see both narratives exhibit this. Peele uses slavery as the monster from which his character must escape, much like Octavia Butler does with her novel Kindred. Slavery, therefore, is the historical marker from which both Peele and Butler make their sci-fi nightmare. Both Peele and Butler enslave their protagonists to illustrate the trauma of slavery both in the past and the present. We're going to explore this idea through the concept of sunken place. Peele coined the concept sunken place, a concept first seen in Get Out. The sunken place is a space that is both literal and metaphorical. An individual in the sunken place is constantly surrounded by external trauma and violence. This is a space that is overwhelming and weighs down on the individual as they lose their sense of self-expression, rendering them completely susceptible to mental and physical violence. The sunken place is only accessed through external forces, which create open wounds that are debilitating to the individual who is sunken. If the individual is able to escape, they do not come back whole, whether in the form of damage to their flesh, personhood, or both. Get Out articulates the sunken place as a physical and mental hold, a regressive site. A regressive site is a place that does not comply with the time period in which it is situated. For Chris to sink into a mental sunken place, he is guided to a state of heightened suggestibility by Rose's mother, Missy. Missy questions him about his mother's death, making him dredge up a suppressed memory. Chris's internalized trauma allows Missy to sink Chris, the ultimate act of intimate violence, a kidnapping of the mind. Chris is left with a reopened wound, and the pain in reopening wounds of his mother's death is evident in Chris's body language. Tears stream down his face, and his eyes widen as he tries to fight back the traumatic memory. His fingers scratching at the chair in which he is sitting as well. You can see this instance in the picture I have pictured here on this slide. Chris not only experiences the sunken place mentally, but also physically. The location of the Armitage family home is isolated and reminiscent of that of a plantation. Furthermore, Victoria Anderson argues, quote, the slavery subtext is hinted early on when we find out that Rose's mother goes by the name of Missy, a common appellation for the mistress of the slaveholding, end quote. Peele uses Missy and the location to demonstrate Chris is stepping back in time to a sunken location. Missy has placed all the Black characters in the sunken place. Her hypnosis is an act of racialized violence. They have been displaced by white characters. They may have bodies, but the Black characters have limited consciousness. Missy has hijacked their psyches. Chris is being hunted by this family. The kidnapping of Black people is a game to the Armitage family. Chris will have to run to save himself. There are many instances of bodily objectifications in Get Out. What he doesn't realize is he's being shown off to potential buyers. Chris is unaware that his body is being auctioned off. At the Armitage party, Chris is introduced to Gordon, who loves golf, and says to Chris, "Let's see your form." Chris's introduction to Lisa and Nelson is much worse. Lisa exclaims, "So how handsome is he?" as she grabs Chris's bicep. While Chris looks visibly uncomfortable, he makes no attempt to move, perhaps too stunned. Lisa then goes on to ask, "So is it true? Is it better?" alluding to Chris's virility. Another one of the bidders comments, "Now the pendulum has swung back. Black is in fashion." This commentary explains why the Armitage family and their inner circle wants to possess Black bodies. The flesh is a fashion statement and a symbol of power and control. The way in which Chris's body is assessed illustrates a modern auction block. The bidders are dehumanizing Chris, and he does not realize the red flags. The flesh is being appraised and touched as bidders make their rounds, meeting Chris. The Armitages are operating a modern form of slavery. Their practice is the ultimate act of regression. The auction is silent and operated with bingo cards, reiterating that this is a game to the Armitage family. The instances that Chris experiences and notices illustrates how explicit Peele is in his depiction of exploiting the Black body. The offenses against the personhood and flesh are that of a reality for Black people in and outside the space of this film. The Black characters the Armitage family has kidnapped, Walter, Georgina, and Andre, have all been operated on. Their brains have been removed and replaced by those of the Armitage's inner circle of family and friends. Georgina and Walter have been displaced by Rose's grandparents. Andre has become Logan, one of the Armitage's friends. When Chris is prepped for his own operation, Jim Hudson, the blind man who bought Chris's body, tells Chris that the piece of his brain connected to his nervous system will still be there, so a sliver of him will remain in limited consciousness, but he'll experience his existence as a passenger and audience. Chris finishes Jim's sentence, "In the sunken place." Jim becomes a slave master with ownership of Chris's consciousness as well as his body, specifically his eyes. Additionally, Roman, Rose's grandfather, tells Chris, "You African Americans have been chosen because of the physical advantages you have endured your entire life. With your natural gifts and our determination, we can be a part of something greater." "We" is exclusive in Roman's statement and does not include Black people. It is white determination enslaving Black bodies. This act of violence is a 21st century form of slavery. They are buying Black bodies, furthering the argument that the Armitage home is a regressive site. Their surgical method abuses the flesh and makes it blatantly clear that the Black body is a site of scientific exploitation. This practice is alienating Black people and dislocating them from society. Peele may have given us the language of sunken place, but these tropes of trauma also occur in Kindred. Butler's novel illustrated these tropes within the scope of Black science fiction long before Peele visualized them on screen. Near-death experiences and severe injury to Rufus's body are what brings Dana back to the past. Rufus is sinking Dana and pulling her against her will to 1800s Maryland. Fear and injury inflicted on Dana's flesh send her back to the present. The abuse of her flesh unsettles Dana. Coming from the 1970s, she's unfamiliar with the extent of this physical violence. She is susceptible to perpetual pain because she is connected to a man whose body is deemed more important than her own. Pain sinks her in and brings her back to illustrate that the trauma she sustains in the sunken place of 1800 Maryland does not stay sunken, it stays with her. Dana cannot escape Maryland or Rufus, the external forces keeping her sunken, because she must ensure Alice is impregnated by Rufus so that her distant grandmother is born. Without the conception of Hagar, Dana would not be born. She is responsible for Rufus despite his disregard for her well-being, and thus she can not prematurely get out of the sunken place. Much like Peele's films, location and people are significant elements to an individual's impact of sunkenness. Alice, Dana, and Rufus are connected to each other for the purpose of creating life despite the objectification and violence against both Black bodies. Even though Alice has now been added to this entanglement, Rufus is still the main source of power and control due to three main factors: gender, race, and setting. Rufus is what sinks both women, the reason being, quote, "Racial difference is also spatial difference. The inequitable power relations between various spaces and places are rearticulated as the inequitable power relations between races," end quote. This inequitable power relation between races is exemplified through Rufus's characterization. The hold that both the location and Rufus have on Alice and Dana is detrimental to both women's personhood, which I go more in depth in within my paper. Dana was unable to remain unimpaired by her travels because that is unrealistic for Black existence during this era. The sunken place does not leave people whole. Parts of their being would be missing through acts of violence against their flesh and disregarding of their personhood. Throughout history and at present, Black bodies are othered and objectified as if they are inhuman. For Dana to experience the horror of antebellum slavery, she would have to bear the markings of the system that broke people and left them without the ability to be whole. Dana's escape from the sunken place leaves her without an arm. She kills Rufus and escapes the sunken place. Despite Dana's freedom from Rufus, she's not free from the trauma inflicted. Part of her remains in the past. Quote, something harder and stronger than Rufus's hand clamped down on my arm, squeezing it, stiffening it, pressing into it, painlessly at first, melting into it, meshing with it, as though somehow my arm here was being absorbed into something cold and unliving, end quote. This is the aftermath of slavery, the memory unforgotten. Butler writes that Dana's arm was absorbed into something cold and unliving. It was the wall between the past and the present, but also Rufus's dead hand pulling Dana back one last time. This gripping hold of Rufus dismembered a piece of her. He's the embodiment of oppression and slavery, much like the Armitage family. Dana now has the physical reminder of escaping the sunken place. Chris does not have the physical reminder of escaping the sunken place, but just like Dana, he is mentally scarred. Chris and Dana had to kill to save themselves. The sunken place ends with death to either the external force or the individual being sunken. Both narratives illustrate loss through the sunken place, each character escaping as a partial being. The loss they experience is phantom pain. Linda Hogan describes phantom pain as a phenomenon that is unlike any other types of pain. No body part need be present for it to occur. It is an apparition, a ghost thought to exist only in the mind as a memory unforgotten. The problem with this pain is its invisibility. It does not always rely on visible evidence, but belongs to secret histories of inner worlds. Racial trauma is phantom pain, felt mentally by the individual. This pain may not be seen, but one can feel it. Quote, a form of wounding, hurting, or defeating. The phenomenon of trauma presupposes the reality of being exposed, open, end quote. By this definition, the phantom pain felt from racial trauma is the pain that is felt when one is in the sunken place. The sunken place leaves individuals exposed with wounds that will fester even after one is able to get out. This is the pain that Black people feel in what Sadie V. Hartman refers to as the aftermath of slavery. It is a ghost sitting within the space of the mind. Phantom pain and racial trauma is effectively articulated through Butler and Peele, illustrating each character's response to both concepts. Kindred provides a useful rubric to assess Get Out. Butler is significant to the space of Black science fiction and speculative fiction. Peele's language and explicit use of the genre's conventions are laid out by Eshton and Derry, solidifying his place within Black science fiction and speculative fiction. Butler and Peele created protagonists who live through constant violence and damage to their flesh and personhood, demonstrating what it means to be Black in America. Having their protagonists live at the end articulates what it means to survive trauma, but also the cost of having to live with mental and physical damage, a reality that most Black Americans face. Both narratives illustrate that the aftermath of slavery has a strong grip on America without any plans of letting go. Black Americans are still trying to escape the sunken place that is systematic oppression, police brutality, and racism. Popular media will circulate comic strips, pictures, and videos of Black Americans who have been abused or killed because of the color of their skin. The trauma of being Black in America is an ever-present wound, festering when exposed to new violence to either the flesh or the personhood. Peele's contribution to Black science fiction makes it blatantly clear that 21st century America is not yet woke. We still have work to do. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Whitney. We'll turn now to our final talk from David.
Thank you very much, Alex, and also to Anna and the BookTalk team for inviting me here this evening. I'm very happy to join. If you just give me 30 seconds, I'm going to share some slides with you. Lovely. Are they showing okay?
Not yet, David.
Oh, sorry, bear with me for 1 second. Is that any better?
Okay, well done. Thanks.
Oh yeah, lovely. Thanks very much. Thanks very much. So as Alex mentioned earlier, today I'm going to talk about Octavia E. Butler's Kindred in relation to Afrofuturism, and argue, perhaps somewhat perversely, that Kindred can be read as a work of Afrofuturism. To start off then, I'm going to ask the question, what is Afrofuturism? And I'm going to start with a definition from Codwo Essen, who Brittany so beautifully introduced us to. Essen wrote that Afrofuturism may be characterized as a program for recovering the histories of counterfutures created in a century hostile to Afro-diasporic projection. I think that notion of a counterfuture, and particularly a Black counterfuture, is a very useful one for us, and it's one to come back to. To help unpack Essen's definition, though, I think it's useful to grasp Afrofuturism as a cultural movement that spans literature, music, and film. So in literature, Octavia Butler is often identified now as one of the foundational figures in this movement. And we might add more recent works, such as the Nigerian-American Nnedi Okorafor's The Book of Phoenix and N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy. In music, Sun Ra, who you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, is a key figure. He played experimental jazz in Chicago in the 1950s and claimed to have come from the planet Saturn. Janelle Monáe's 2018 motion picture, Dirty Computer, which you can see an image from on the right of your screen, is a more recent example. In film, we have works like that of the Kenyan director Wanuri Kaihu's Pumzi and Ryan Coogler's 2018 smash hit Black Panther. All of these various works that we've just seen, imagine what Essen describes as Black counterfutures, the imagination of future worlds in which Black characters play a major and usually sort of positive or affirmative roles, such as Chadwick Boseman's character T'Challa in Black Panther, who you can see on the right of the screen and also below. This might not seem that extraordinary to us today, but it certainly was when Butler started writing. And Butler kind of records the way that when she used to go to various sort of science fiction conventions, she was often the only Black person present. And the other white writers that she encountered were white, the editors were white, and most of the futures that the writers imagined were filled with white people. So in that context, for her to be imagining science fictional stories, what Brittany described as Black science fiction, was sort of quite remarkable. So Octavia Butler, as I mentioned, is now widely recognised as an Afrofuturist writer. But what about her 1979 novel Kindred? Is this work of Afrofuturism? It might seem obviously not to be. After all, it's more concerned with the past and history as Dana travels back in time from her present in 1976 to the past in pre-Civil War Maryland. By contrast, Afrofuturism, as its name suggests, typically imagines future worlds. And certainly, as both Josie and Brittany have shown very beautifully, the novel uses this sort of time travel conceit to explore the persistence of the past in the present. It kind of explores the persistence of slavery in the present and the historical trauma, what Brittany referred to as the aftermath of slavery. And I think that this is one of Kindred's greatest achievements as a novel. Yet at the same time, I wish to suggest that Kindred can also be read as an exploration of orientations to the future, and thereby as a work of Afrofuturism. To do so, I'm going to turn in slightly more detail to the time travel paradox that is central to the novel's conceit. And I'm going to read out a scene from the novel. You have to remember that this is Dana who is the narrator, so it's her who is speaking. She writes, still, now I had a special reason for being glad I'd been able to save Rufus. So Dana has just travelled back to the past and she's pulled Rufus, who is her white and later plantation-owning ancestor, out of the river and saved him from drowning. After all, what would have happened to me, to my mother's family, if I hadn't saved him? Was that why I was here? Not only to ensure the survival of one accident-prone small boy, but to ensure my family's survival, my own birth. Again, what would have happened if the boy had drowned? Would he have drowned without me? Or would his mother have saved him somehow? Would his father have arrived in time to save him? His life could not depend on the actions of his unconceived descendant. No matter what I did, he would have to survive to Father Hagar, or I could not exist. That made sense. But somehow it didn't make enough sense to give me any comfort. It didn't make enough sense for me to test it by ignoring him if I found him in trouble again. Not that I could have ignored any child in trouble. But this child needed special care. If I was to live, if others were to live, he must live. I didn't dare test the paradox. So the paradox that Dana mentions is a classic science fictional conceit. The idea is one, it kind of asks you, like, can you imagine if you go back in time, could you do something like stop your grandparents from ever meeting? That would mean that you would never be conceived, you would never be born, and you would never exist. But if that was the case, how could you then go back in time to stop them from meeting before? That's the sort of mind-boggling idea that science fiction writers like playing with. In this context, Dana is having to keep her white ancestor Rufus alive at all costs. We might also pick up on the verb that Dana uses, which is to ensure. She says, not only to ensure the survival of one accident-prone small boy, but to ensure my family's survival, my own birth. To ensure most immediately means to make sure that Rufus does survive so Dana can be born in turn. But it can also be heard as carrying connotations of a more technical register of insurance and the insurance industry. What we talk about when we say you could insure a car or you could insure a house. This is exactly the argument that the scholar Lin Hua makes in her brilliant article on the subject, and she talks about what she calls speculative time. She writes that speculative time underscores the correlation between whiteness and futurity that is secured through contractual investments in the slave trade. To understand or appreciate this point, I think we need to have a bit of historical background or historical context and a bit of knowledge about the transatlantic slave trade, which was the trade that took enslaved Africans, transported them across the Atlantic to the Caribbean and the United States, where they're made to work usually on sugar, coffee, or cotton plantations. Now that trade was made possible in large part by the insurance industry and insurance companies like Lloyd's Insurance. If you think of the great risks of going in a ship across the Atlantic Ocean, that ship could potentially sink, it could be attacked by pirates. The entire ship could be lost, which from the perspective of this slave traders could be financially devastating. It could sort of bankrupt them. Insurance was a mechanism of mitigating that risk, meaning that even if the ship was lost, the trader would not go bankrupt. Now, how does that all relate to Kindred, and how does the idea of speculative time relate back? Well, Hua's argument is that Dana is actually enthralled to a very similar idea of speculative time. And when she goes back to the past, she behaves in a way that wishes to kind of secure what Hua calls a white future in the same way as, say, insurers and the traders did. That's a very uncomfortable attitude or suggestion to make about Dana, who is, after all, an African-American character who is going back to the pre-Civil War past and experiencing these various atrocities. I think one of our main reactions might be to sympathize with her, to think of her as the heroine of this story. But Hua suggests that things are not so simple. And in particular, we might focus on Dana's relationship with Alice, and the fact that in the novel, as Josie pointed out earlier, Dana is complicit in Alice's rape to make sure that she is born. I'm going to turn to look at that scene briefly. So Dana is thinking, she's talking about Rufus's mind was on Alice. So Alice, you remember in the novel, she was a Black free woman, but was later enslaved by Rufus. I thought that eventually he would just rape her again and again. In fact, I was surprised that he hadn't already done it. I didn't realize that he was planning to involve me in that rape. He was, and he did. So Rufus sends Dana to talk to Alice and asks Dana to instruct Alice to visit Rufus that evening and to tell her that if she resists, she will be whipped. This is Alice's response. Alice began to cry. I ought to take a knife in there with me and cut his damn throat. She glared at me. Now go tell him that. Tell him that I'm talking about killing him. Tell him yourself, replies Dana. Do your job, go tell him. That's what you for, to help white folks keep Black folks down. That's why he sent you to me. They'd be calling you mummy in a few years. You'd be running the whole house when their old man dies. In this scene, Alice very clearly expresses her anger towards Dana. She says that Dana is acting in the interests of the white plantation owners and that she is keeping the other Black folks down. The idea that Hua suggests is that by doing so, Dana is actually acting in conformity with speculative time, and is showing a marked lack of solidarity with the other Black women that she encounters in the past, and particularly with Alice. She does not portray the sort of solidarity between Black women that feminists like Audre Lorde were advocating for in the 1970s. So just to finish up my presentation, I'd like to suggest that by exploring this speculative time, this is what makes Kindred a work of Afrofuturism. It's not just a story about the past and going back into the past, but it's also a novel that invites us to think about orientations to the future. One of the things that you might do as you read the book is you think, was Dana right to act the way that she did towards Alice and the other characters? Could she have acted any differently? Could she have perhaps changed history rather than sort of simply going along with it? I'm personally not going to answer or kind of give my opinion about those questions. I think they're very interesting ones to think about. But I think the fact that the novel makes us or invites us to ask them is what makes it a work of Afrofuturism and aligns it with some of Octavia Butler's later works, such as Parable of the Sower. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, and to all the speakers. I'm going to invite our panelists to come back on their videos, if that's all right. Absolutely fascinating papers, so thank you. And they speak to each other in very interesting and I think quite sort of tendentious ways in some respects. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion. We have a number of excellent questions in the Q&A, and if you've got other questions, feel free to pop them in there, and we'll see how many we can get through. But I thought that we might kick off, if I may, with a question that's sort of for all of the panelists, and perhaps to bring some of the papers together. And this is picking up on some of the questions that David posed at the end of his paper, which I think have really interesting implications for both Brittany and Josie's arguments. And so I'd love to hear if they have any initial thoughts about that. And so I was wondering, this question that David asked about, could Dana have changed the past? So, you know, is the science fiction trope of time travel enough to suggest that that was actually a possibility if she was if she identified herself as being sort of called back by Alice, say, rather than being called back by Rufus, which is a kind of a line of argument that Lin Hua makes in that same essay that David was using. So I wonder if either of you have any thoughts about this question, or David, if you'd like to elaborate on your paper.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be very happy to say a little bit more about that. I think it also relates to a question that Angelique has just asked in the chat as well, which was, why was Dana able to kill where Alice was not? I think it is really interesting to read that scene again very closely, because Dana gives Alice various alternatives when Rufus has called her. She says, well, you could just go and could go along with it. You could go and see Rufus and just accept the fact that you have no alternative. Or you could try and resist. You could, for instance, try to run away from the house. But she never actually raises that alternative of trying to actually kill Rufus. And as Angelique points out, that is exactly what Dana ends up doing. She ends up kind of killing killing her. So I think it is a sort of interesting omission. We might wonder why. Was it because she was so invested on her own survival, even if that's going to be at the expense of Alice and others? I don't know whether Josie and Brittany have any kind of opinions or thoughts or takes on that.
Yeah, I can come in there. I mean, just as you were saying that, I was thinking it's interesting because in a way she is constantly changing the past because she's constantly saving Rufus, right? But then ostensibly nothing actually changes because, you know, Alice is raped and her great-grandma gets born. From an epigenetic perspective, one of the things that I didn't really get the chance to talk about, but I guess there are two sides of epigenetics. There's the kind of intergenerational inheritance, but also this discovery that epigenetic marks can be switched on and off also means that you have the ability, or your body can change genetic structure within your own lifetime, according to the environment in which you are in. And this also speaks to, I think, one of the questions that's in the chat about how can we understand this maybe more positively. It's that the body is in a constant dynamic relationship with its environment, and we can think about it as much more plastic and mutable and changeable rather than something that is fixed. So I guess that's another way in which I think that the novel kind of speaks to what's happening in epigenetics, in the sense that in some ways we can't change the basics of the past and of what happened, but it does have the ability to change us, and we can kind of use knowledge that we have, and we can change in the present. And that's what I was trying to kind of emphasize in my presentation with Dana's, how she kind of uses that, her new knowledge. I'll let Brittany.
Thinking through Peele's concept of sunken place, Alice succumbs so far into the trauma that she is having enacted on her body. She has been subject to intimate violence through Rufus raping her. So ultimately she does commit suicide. But even if she does not commit suicide and the book were to take a turn where Alice were to kill Rufus, she also has to contend with the fact that she has the possibility of being killed on this plantation site because she is a Black woman. Dana has been afforded some luxuries in the fact that she is able to come back to the 1970s, where Alice is going to be stuck within the space of 1800 Maryland. She does not have the ability to move back and forth between time, whereas Dana has that ability to do so. She also has Kevin as an ally by being her husband and a white male in this space.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too, Brittany, because in the novel, it's really interesting how Dana experiences the antebellum past as sort of more real in some ways, that everything's heightened, everything's more visceral, and partly it's because of the, you know, the kind of awful circumstances and the kind of like pain that she's experiencing, which heightens everything. But then she always maintains a sense of herself as from another time and as returning to it and belonging to it. And I guess that's where Lin Hua's argument would come into play, which is to say, for obvious reasons, she's invested in a future in which she exists, right? And that she sees herself as always coming from. But it poses some really interesting ethical questions about what is kind of owed to people in the past, or what kind of ethical decisions can get made in response to your own survival and that kind of thing. So that's really interesting. Thank you so much. We have lots of questions in the chat, which is wonderful. So let's see if we can try and like move through them. So Josie, I think you did just touch on a little bit something related to Simar Kaur's questions at the top of the chat, which are really, really helpful. So thinking about kind of the lived experience of genocide and kind of the resilience of trauma survivors. And so they ask if you might highlight, and maybe expand upon some of those positives of knowing epigenetics for Black people. And I think there's another question actually down below. Oh, sorry, one second. Oh yes, Devika Karnad's question about how epigenetics might consider a generational inheritance or a bodily manifestation of the white characters in the novel. And I was wondering about that too, actually. So the sense in the novel is very much that this is a shared history, actually, that both Dana and Rufus need to come to terms with. And that's sort of why they both end up having this desire to go back to Maryland and to find concrete evidence that these people existed. So perhaps would you like to expand on either of those questions for us?
Yeah, sure. So in relation to the first question, I think for me, where the kind of maybe more positive side of epigenetics comes in, and where this relates to the novel as well, is it allows us to think about the concept of race itself completely differently. Because, you know, the concept that we've lived with for hundreds of years, that was invented in the 18th century, was that there are these fixed genetic biological differences between races, and that, you know, these are somehow, you know, there are maybe different groups who are biologically different from one another. And we've seen lots of different science, the Human Genome Project, kind of contradict that and come up with different narratives. But I think what epigenetics clearly shows, and what this novel clearly shows, is that race is something that's made, and it's the product of racist fantasy. So what we see is Dana's body, her biology is changed by racism. It's not some kind of natural or biological inheritance. It is the direct product of being in a racist environment. That is what creates race. That's what makes her an African-American woman. So I think it's offering us a much more kind of interesting way of thinking about race as a kind of a fiction made real, essentially. This kind of racist fantasy made real in these kinds of biological changes to the body. And for me, that's a very productive way of thinking about race, and a way to kind of counter the more deterministic traditional narratives about race. And then thinking in terms of the question about the intergenerational inheritance of Rufus and Tom, I mean, there is a point in the novel where Kevin and Dana are kind of observing people, and she says she could see the marks of his environment was leaving its marks on him when she's thinking about Rufus. So she's kind of aware of that. But as you were saying, Alex, what's really interesting about this novel, especially if you thinking about it in the 70s, is that it does show that, you know, again, and this relates to race, that, you know, black and white people were mixing, and they were the same family. They were kindred. And if you compare that to the kind of, the kind of major narrative of the 70s, which was Haley's Roots, which was all about, a single kind of Black family line from Africa to the present. He actually did a lot of history research into his Irish family history, but none of that made it into the novel. It became this sort of, novel about Black ancestry that was told in this very linear way. I think Butler does something much more kind of interesting and complex in showing the kind of entanglement of of the two families and their kind of the ways in which they kind of develop together. So I think it's a kind of much more interesting novel in that respect to a lot of the kind of slightly more simplistic and singular narratives that were around at that time.
Right, and I think that really connects to the kind of context of the Black Power movement, right, and the emphasis on sort of Black nationalism and separation of races rather than assimilation that you get in the earlier civil rights movements. I think that's really helpful. Thank you. We have lots of questions for Brittany. So obviously people are really interested in your connection between Get Out and Kindred, which is wonderful. Hannah asks about how you sort of initially connected these two texts and what brought you to study them together. And I wonder if you might think about that alongside one of the other questions, perhaps Demetra McBrayer's, in which they suggest, that the idea of the sunken place is a very compelling way of thinking about trauma and about Blackness. And could you sort of push that a little bit further or think about it in relation to other texts across media? Would you like to answer those questions?
Yes, definitely. I had seen Get Out when it came out in 2017. I thought it was a phenomenal film. Peele has been compared to Alfred Hitchcock, and I would definitely agree, thinking through camera angles, shots, and all of that good stuff. And The Sunken Place was something that kind of stayed with me, but I didn't really do too much with it until reading Kindred a few years ago. And that illuminated what I was thinking through with The Sunken Place, but just didn't really have something to really say, oh, okay, this is how we can use The Sunken Place in spaces other than just film. And so after reading Kindred and watching Get Out again, that's where this whole paper started from. And that, like I said, was a few years ago, about 2018, 2019. And so just thinking through what science fiction means and how it's been used to distort American history with the degradation and scientific exploitation of Black bodies and Black flesh. Towards Demetra's question, I can definitely see this on many different types of novels and works by African-American writers. But also, I think if we're putting this not only just with film, but with novels, I can see this in America itself. James Baldwin, one of my favorite quotes by him is, to love America is to critique America. And I definitely think America is somewhat of a sunken place in the ways in which we see police brutality, especially over the summer, everything happening with Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the countless many other Black Americans that have lost their lives. We see this and thinking through the concept of how do you get free and does freedom exist in that way? I think we can put Sunken Place into the reality of what it means to be Black in America and in other spaces too.
Yeah.
But also if we're thinking through Black science fiction text, Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents would be some great examples. Also River Solomon's and Unkindness of Ghosts too.
Thank you. Yeah, and that sort of speaks to what David was saying as well about how we might place this novel within some larger context. Britt, might I follow up on that? I was wondering actually if you'd thought about the figure of the zombie in relation to The Sunken Place as well, because my understanding is that in mainstream film, the zombie film is like perceived from the perspective of a white anxiety about slave insurrection, right? That those who have been sort of enslaved will come back and fight you. Whereas in like a Afrofuturist sort of counter tradition, the zombie is about articulating or representing, embodying the experience of slavery, right? So the zombie as a sunken place figure, somebody who is in their body but is a kind of living death, I suppose. And I wonder if, you don't need to answer this, but that's another way we could think about this in the tradition of the zombie film as well, and perhaps connected to David's sense of this as an Afrofuturist text. David, could we turn to you there then? I wonder if you might elaborate a little more on, a few other people have asked questions. Strummer Still has asked about, other ways we might think about Jordan Peele's like larger body of work in relation to the sunken place. And there's been some questions as well about what it means to connect Peele to a tradition of speculative fiction as distinct from horror, which is a similar move to what you're doing as well, right? By suggesting that actually we get a sort of orientation towards the future in this novel of the past. So do you have any thoughts about what are the different ways that we might place this novel? Like, is it productive to think about it in those various different strains? And do they show us different things, I suppose?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I really like, the way that Brittany describes it as Black sci-fi, I think is a very, I think that it's a really productive way of thinking about Kindred, and that relates. There's another question in the chat about what were sort of Butler's influences. Why does she suddenly turn to that as a form? And Butler writes about the fact that she sort of read obsessively other examples of science fiction, including sort of short stories that were published in pulp magazines, things like Amazing Stories from the 30s onwards, as long as other ones, but found that to be a sort of, I think she was both drawn to that genre, but also found its sort of limitations, and particularly the way that it represented Black characters or African-American characters. I'm also interested in the way that I think we can kind of situate Butler's work and other works within a wider sort of range of genres that African-American writers turn to explore some of these issues. And thinking back to some of Josie's points we're making about kind of trauma and epigenetics, that made me think about other sort of kind of conceits of ghost stories, thinking particularly of kind of Toni Morrison's Beloved as being a classic text, but sort of more recent ones like, I'm thinking of, sorry, I've got one behind me. Jasmine Ward's Sing on Buried Sing is another example of using a kind of ghost story and people coming back from the past to sort of haunt the present, being another way of using kind of genre fiction to kind of explore some of these themes.
This is a question for everyone, but Demetra has made another really interesting point in relation to not just the construction of these texts, but also the ways that they're assembled and marketed. And I know that Anna also sent me a private message. She's interested in how the reception history of Kindred has shaped our understanding of it, how it's been received in subsequent generations. So I wonder if there's a question for anyone, I suppose, about how these questions connect to the way people categorize this book, or how they, even down to how they, design covers for it to kind of represent its different generic sort of impulses, I suppose.
If we're thinking about the materiality of the text, I definitely think throughout the years, many of the editions have kind of hinted around the plantation subtext, but they don't explicitly make that clear until we get Damien Duffy and John Jennings' copy of the graphic novel adaptation of Kindred, and you see a pair of black hands bound by handcuffs and a white hand grabbing onto it. And I think that is so rhetorically important to what the text is actually saying compared to the other illustrations that we've seen in the past.
Thank you.
I think, it's interesting to think how little control authors have over those choices as well, and what genre their fiction or their books kind of get put in, and then how people then read and understand them. And I know people like Nadia Okorafor often object to the fact that her fiction's often classed as kind of young adult fiction, which is potentially a sort of patronizing term for what she's doing. I think it's also like one of the features of this, like particularly Butler, is she always kind of negotiates the genre or where her books are being placed within her books. So she often has scenes in Kindred. There are ones where Dana goes back and she talks about the science fiction she's reading. Similarly, in Parable of the Sower, she talks about certain like subgenres of science fiction, and kind of she implicitly sets herself up in relational contrast to those. That's another way that it's negotiated, I think.
Yeah, I was wondering too about, I mean, she mentions Frederick Douglass's, slave narratives, and you can think of Kindred as a kind of neo-slave narrative in that kind of register, I suppose, of picking. And actually, I think some scholars have shown how her information about the plantation life is derived directly from Douglass's writing. So I think it's got a really interesting kind of historical background as well. Derek Dunn, who's one of our colleagues at Cardiff, has made a really interesting observation about how the kind of present day locations that are the starting point for both of these narratives are sort of urban, actually kind of liberal, kind of middle class America in LA and NYC, these places that kind of falsely, I think, thought of in distinction to places in the South, which is sort of demonized as the site of racism, right? So I wonder if anyone has any observations about how these either texts, really, Kindred or Get Out, negotiate sort of why that is, I guess, and how they think about questions of region. I mean, I know Get Out, it was filmed in Georgia. Where was it filmed? It's filmed in the South.
It was filmed in 2 different places in Alabama, Fairhope and Mobile.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so it's got a really interesting kind of, but at the same time, the house looks like the house from Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, this wonderful film with Sidney Poitier, which it's actually modelled on as well, which in that film is in LA, I think. So the film is sort of knowing, I think, about these crossings and about the non-difference, I suppose, between South and North in relation to race. Does anyone have any observations about that? That's just a nice comment anyway from Derek.
I could just make an observation about Parable of the Sower. Is I think sort of reinforces or kind of echoes Derek's point, is that most of the action of that novel is set in California, but there are explicit parallels drawn between the movement that Lauren Olamina, who's the kind of heroine of that novel, she moves from South California to North California, and that's very explicitly compared with the movements of formerly enslaved people from the South to the North. And I suppose that's one way of kind of reinforcing some of the ideas that Brittany was talking about, the fact that there is the persistence of these issues in different places, in these more supposedly kind of liberal places. There's also, just come back to Alex's point, about the Frederick Douglass, who was formerly enslaved and became a sort of major abolitionist. Was there in Parable of the Sower, Lauren's partner is explicitly compared to a photograph of Frederick Douglass, which sets up some of these parallels. And again, her kind of group of people is compared to sort of the Underground Railroad kind of running up. So that's just to, really to kind of agree with Derek's observation.
Yeah, thank you. Well, so Strummer Steele has a question that's for both Josie and for Brittany. So perhaps if we go to Josie first, Strummer wonders about what you might say about how we could extend the idea of epigenetics to some of Butler's other works.
Yeah, I really hadn't thought about it, to be honest. I was thinking about Parable of the Sower when I saw that question. What I find really interesting about Butler, one of the things I find interesting about her, is that she kind of went in a very kind of different and sometimes unfashionable directions to the kinds of thinking at the time. And one of the ways that she does that is obviously Epigenetics is something that comes along long after any of these novels were published, but she does engage with sociobiology, which was around in the 70s, which is a very, I don't know if people know about it, it's a very kind of controversial science. Some people would say it's a pseudoscience that kind of attributes biological causes of social behavior and social kind of characteristics. Whereas most kind of left-wing academics, intellectuals were kind of rejecting biological understandings of being human. Butler actually in an interview says, no, I'm not afraid of sociobiology. Yes, there are always going to be people who try to make it into kind of deterministic, go down that road. But actually, I think she says, all we have is the body, all we have is the flesh. And she continually comes back to the body and to the materialism of the body, which I think she does in a lot of her work, in ways in which I think that are kind of really ahead of its time, I would say. Now it's very fashionable in academia of people talking about the body, thinking about biology and the material, and Butler was doing it in her very own way. When everyone else was kind of, humanities scholars were kind of reacting against it. So that doesn't really answer the question, but it's a really good question, and I'll definitely have a think about it. Her other novels in relation to epigenetics.
That's the thing about all good questions, right, is they are their own insight, they give their own insight. And I think so many of these have actually. Can I ask Brittany, would you like to extend your thinking about the sunken place in relation to, say, Us or Jordan Peele's larger work?
The first two drafts of the article and my research when I started thinking through Jordan Peele's work in relation to Kindred had Us in it, thinking through his concept of tethering and the idea of Alice, Dana, and Rufus being in a sort of triangular tethering, Rufus being at the top, and both of these women are tethered or bound to Rufus. And the only way, and this is extending the sunken place, the only way to sever the tether would be to enact some sort of bodily harm to either the external force, being Rufus, or to Dana or Alice. In a way, Dana is cutting the tether between herself and Alice. When she's cutting Alice down from, in the barn, she has hung herself, and she's cutting down what looks to be a doppelganger of herself. And if we're thinking through Us has doppelgangers. So you have Adelaide and you have Red. And in similar ways, you have Alice and Dana in that sort of space. And so cutting down the similar self, which is Alice to Dana, would be the kind of severing of a tether. And we see that with Us, which is, again, another concept coming from Peele. But yes, I would love to do more work outside the space of this paper, because Us just couldn't really work in the direction that I took it. I would say that is definitely a horror film if we're trying to put it in a genre category. But I would like to work through Us with Sylvia Wynter and some other wonderful Black feminists.
Well, I'm sure all of our participants will be very glad to read that once it comes out, Brittany. Thank you. We are out of time, unfortunately, but the good thing is the remaining questions are, in that zone of offering really interesting just points of contact or different texts that we might look at in these, in relation to Kindred and the ideas that our panelists have raised. And particularly, I think there's a wonderful point here by Sally Jones about how we could think of the sunken place as the sea, and as being connected to the transatlantic slave trade and the horrific losses that were, seen as David said, seen as sort of financial losses, and these just horrific losses of human life, in which the UK and many other Western, countries are completely implicated. So I think that actually is a nice place to leave for today. And I'd like to just thank my fellow co-panelists. I've just found this discussion so fascinating. And thanks again to Anna and the team at BookTalk for putting this together. I'll hand over to Anna now, who will give us a bit of a sense of what's coming up next for BookTalk.
Yes, thank you so much, Alex, and thank you to all our panelists. I'm just going to say a few words to close the evening tonight, starting with a huge thank you to all the panelists and a virtual round of applause, if we can do that, because it was really fascinating to hear about your research. And your exploration of the significance of Butler in relation to epigenetics, Black science fiction, Afrofuturism, and so much more than that too. So thank you very much to Joseph Gill, Brittany Henry, and David Shackleton, and our host, Alex Beeston. There are links in the chat to works by our speakers this evening, and if you didn't catch them all, then you can go to cardiffbooktalk.org or find us on Twitter or other social media for all the information. Attendees should also look out for an email with a feedback survey following tonight, and we will share the recording of this event shortly too. So if you want to rewatch anything or just review what's been said, then it will be placed online too. Thank you so much to our audience. You have been brilliant, and the questions have been really